have to say. This is super exciting topic.
Great, thanks.
Well, we're very excited. I think we'll go ahead and get started, and I'll just start admitting people as they filter through. But Victoria, thanks for sharing your enthusiasm. It was really fortuitous because I reached out to Professor Vaca in July, and that was kind of the strategy before the semester was going to start and he was getting a burden with things. And then once he accepted, it became a question of, and who would be a great person to be a moderator on this particular topic? And kind of thought, and of course Kevin Roose's name came up, and lo and behold, Kevin lives in Oakland, which I did not know. So here we are, the Brown Club of Greater San Francisco, which certainly includes Oakland, and we're so proud to have both you great Brown affiliated people as well as Kevin as a local boy, at least for now. So I'm just going to go ahead and do a short intro. My name is Lisa Ryers. I'm class of 1990. I'm one of the co-presidents of the Brown Club of Greater San Francisco. And I'm proud to welcome as our moderator tonight, Kevin Roose, class of 2009, and I'm using Twitter bios to keep it really short and succinct, tech columnist for the New York Times, reporter of Rabbit Hole podcast, author of Future Proof and other books, and a former GeoCities webmaster, as well as our guest tonight, which is Professor Daniel Vaca, who is the assistant professor at Brown University, faculty fellow 2020-2021 at Harvard's Warren Center, author of Evangelicals Incorporated, and associate editor of A Universe of Terms. Welcome, you both.
Thank you. So I think how we'll do this is that Professor Vaca will tell us a little bit about his new book, and then I'll ask some questions, and then we can just open it up for Q&A. I'm gonna go grab my copy of the book right now, so I have it in front of me.
Oh, right. I don't have my copy with me.
Right here, it's great. Okay. Made my way through most of it last night.
Oh, great, great. So I have a presentation. Let me go ahead and share the screen here. How's that? Can you all see that? Can you all, so you can all see that? Okay, great. I took the laughter of the handshake with Jesus as indication of that. Well, first of all, thanks so much for inviting me to do this. It's a real pleasure to be here with all of you. Yeah, and I have an affinity for California anyway. I grew up there. My family lives out there in the LA area, not in the Bay Area, but yeah, I'm a California kid. So I thought I'd just tell you a little bit about myself, and then tell you about my book. Just to keep it real brief, I am an assistant professor at Brown. I teach in the Department of Religious Studies. I don't know how many of you have taken courses in religious studies or took courses in religious studies when you were there. But in our department, religion is this giant social phenomenon, and people in our department cover all kinds of traditions and places and time periods, but I teach about religious life in the US. So I can talk more about what that includes if you all would like. But the short version is that a lot of my teaching ends up being about the relationship between religious life, economic life, and also media.
Okay, if you can't get the link, let me know.
Is that, oh.
And if you could go ahead and mute yourselves on your end while the professor is speaking, that would be great.
Yeah, no worries. So that intersection between religious life, economic life, and media is really where my book comes out of. So I'll tell you a little bit about my book, which came out at the end of last year, and I won't presume that any of you have actually read it. And my goal here is not really to tell you everything that's in it. It's a few hundred pages. Instead, I just want to give you a sense of how to think about the things in the title of the book and in the title of this this little presentation here. I want to give you a sense of how to think about these things together, right? So business, especially the media business, evangelicals, politics, And, you know, all of this helps us understand this incredible time we're in, right? Including ongoing evangelical support of Donald Trump. So a place to start is with books. So here are some popular evangelical books from the last 2 decades. I honestly just randomly chose these. I was just going through Google image searches and just putting them up for you. Here, you know, if you know anything about evangelical cultures, you might recognize some of these. And I share these because, you know, the book focuses on the business of books. And I'm sometimes asked, you know, why is that? And, you know, it is, for some people, it seems a little bit kind of esoteric or something like that. And one reason I think for this is that, you know, books sound like old tech for us, right? We're in the streaming era. We've all been at home just downloading like, you know, new seasons of kind of all kinds of series. I don't know how many threads, text threads I've been on with kind of like new show recommendations between friends. So, you know, books seem like old tech sometimes, but also, you know, a lot of what people know about evangelicalism is associated in our minds with televangelists, right? So a lot of the most prominent figures that you might know about are people like this, Joel Osteen, and if you haven't watched his, you can see it on YouTube where Kanye West appears at Joel Osteen's church and gives a Kanye sermon. I sort of recommend it to you if you just want to watch something kind of wacky. So Paula White, T.D. Jakes, and even Jerry Falwell Jr., who's not quite a televangelist, but is sort of, you might have seen him mostly in kind of TV news or something like that. So, you know, these people bring to mind maybe TV, but not books, right? And, you know, these are fair, the sort of why books question is a fair one, I think. But in response to that, I really offer at least 2 things. The first point is really that all of these people, virtually every kind of prominent evangelical figure is also an author. So, you know, Joel Osteen, Paul White, T.D. Jakes, and not Jerry Falwell Jr., you know, who's more known recently for, I don't even know what to call it, photos on boats and I won't get into the other stuff. Maybe we could talk about that afterward. But Jerry Falwell's dad, Jerry Falwell Sr., did write quite a number of books. You know, buying books and either reading them or at least using them as a symbol of identity has been a primary way that Americans have become part of evangelical culture for the past 100 years, but especially for the past 50 years or so. And, you know, this demand for evangelical books is part of why they've sold at such a high volume. And, you know, you might not be aware of this, but, you know, evangelical books have been some of the best-selling books in American history, especially recent American history, right? So this is just a screenshot here of the bestsellers of the 70s. So the best-selling book in 72, 73, 74, 75 were all evangelical books, right? You might think of the Living Bible as not like a book, but actually it was just a kind of paraphrase of the Bible by this guy, Kenneth Taylor. And then again, in the 2000s, books like The Prayer of Jabez, The Purpose-Driven Life, 2 years in a row, and then The Secret and Sarah Palin's book are arguably not in the same category as Rick Warren's book, but I put them there because they're both, Sarah Palin's book especially is very evangelically, and it's published by HarperCollins, which is related to an evangelical publishing company, as I will explain. And just the last thing about kind of the scale of sales figures for evangelical books, I'll just note that, you know, so Rick Warren here was chosen to pray at Obama's first inauguration. And that was really, I think, because his book sales were sort of unprecedented and, well, were in the tens of millions, and that made him look like a representative of America's evangelicals. So here's a kind of ad for The Purpose-Driven Life, which was his book, often described as the best-selling nonfiction hardback book in history. So why books? One is this kind of scale. Another answer to the why books question is just to point to the giant commercial infrastructure that has been built up to make books culturally significant for evangelicals. And that infrastructure features especially evangelical bookstores. Again, if you grew up evangelical, you might have spent time in these sorts of things. You might recognize something like family Christian stores from just driving around the suburbs. But if you don't know these things firsthand, you can I give you this just to flag for you that there's a lot of them, right? There were a lot of them anyway. They've sort of disappeared largely the past 10, 15 years or so. But in the 90s when they were at their peak, there was almost as many Christian bookstores as like Lowe's and Home Depot now put together, right? And that just gives you this kind of sense of scale. So why books? Because books are heart of an ecosystem of commercial media and corporate power. And I think I would even say that the media economy around evangelical books is what allowed televangelists to become as big as they became. People like Joel Osteen actually make their fortunes from books, especially. And any kind of history of other evangelical media industries ends up sort of being related to books, right? So the rise of the Christian music industry really emerged out of a foundation of bookstores, which were sort of central sites of sales. So that's why books. As for what does the popularity and scale of the evangelical book industry tell us about evangelicalism and evangelicals? The main thing I want to say just for now, and we can get into other stuff after in discussion, the main thing you need to know to understand the effect of media for evangelicals is just to know that there's no sort of central kind of authority structure for evangelicalism, right? There's no Vatican, right, which is sort of dispensing kind of authoritative doctrine. There's no single authority for membership or conformity or anything like that. And so, how are evangelicals identified? Since the 70s, when surveys really started paying more attention to religious identity and really kind of counting evangelicals and reporting that out through journalists and scholars, the only real kind of way that people identify themselves as evangelicals is just by saying they were, right? So the survey question says, are you evangelical? Yes or no. And so this was a way of kind of marking a kind of cultural identity. And the cultural identity was something that, we often think about evangelicals as being kind of really doctrine focused or something like that, but it's not really about doctrines. Even kind of evangelical research organizations will have, kind of admitted, here's a screenshot from one report from this organization, Lifeway. They admit that it's not really about beliefs, right? So when people say I'm an evangelical for a survey, they're really talking about cultural identity, about ways of thinking, about ways of seeing the world, about ways of seeing yourself and others, priorities for living. And we can talk more about what some of those are, about evangelical obsessions and characteristics, aspects of evangelical culture. But the main point I want to make for now is that all of these things are learned. Aspects of evangelical identity, ideas about sex and gender and masculinity and true womanhood and the military, they're all learned, and they're learned lots of places, right? In churches, for instance, in small groups, in college campuses. Kevin wrote a great book about Liberty University. He learned a lot of evangelical culture there. But evangelical culture is also and especially learned through media consumption, I argue. And so finally, this leads me to business and politics. And what I point out in my book is that for-profit media corporations have been incredibly influential on shaping evangelical media cultures. And one way to see that is just to recognize that since the late 80s, prominent evangelical companies like Zondervan and Thomas Nelson have been owned by giant media conglomerates, largely, above all, News Corp. News Corp owned Zondervan in 1988 and Thomas Nelson in 2011, I think. And now they're kind of united under the rubric of HarperCollins Christian. And so what does this mean? What are the kind of implications of corporate power in evangelical media? The first, implication among many that we can think about is that News Corp in particular has sought to have its markets support each other, to find, executives at Zondervan will tell you sort of off the record that, they, look for and are told to find synergies with Fox News, right? And that's part of why, it's like an open secret, right? So if you watch Fox News or Fox News business channel, for an hour or something like that, you're likely to see some sort of reference to or figure from evangelical culture. And these are just two screenshots from two articles that I found just, an hour ago as I was putting this together. So there's a lot of explicit evangelicalism in the kind of in the Fox News kind of realm, and scholars and journalists have done a really good job. There's a bunch of reporting about how much of a firm hold Fox News has over the political base of Donald Trump, over the modern Republican Party, and so if you think about that, and then you think about kind of clear connections with an evangelical audience, it makes a lot of sense that Donald Trump's media market includes a lot of evangelicals, and they're kind of conjured through this kind of intersection with Fox News. And a second thing about corporate power in evangelical media is just to note that corporate strategies of market making and maximizing profit have been really powerful in shaping how evangelical cultural groups have formed. So in my book, I devote each chapter really to kind of a sort of area of market concern, kind of market strategies that especially have helped make evangelical culture a really kind of white and conservative cultural group. And the last chapter of the book focuses especially on market strategies around niches and market segmentation. So I just want to show you some of that as a kind of example of what I'm talking about. So niches and market segmentation, I don't need to get into detail about this. You can read the chapter. If you don't have the book, I can try to share it with you. So I don't want to get into too much detail right now, but just to kind of give you the broad strokes about, what is a market segment, how does sort of niche marketing work. The main thing to know is that market segmentation as a strategy really took off in the book industry, especially in the 1980s. And it was really a move away from the idea that companies had to make products that tried to reach the mass market and some sort of idealized generic consumer. So the idea is really that, companies should recognize that consumers are different, and companies should recognize those differences, try to kind of quantify them, and then give those niches products tailored to the particular preferences that make them up. And so for evangelical companies, one of the first forays into this that I talk about is by the creation of the New International Version of the Bible, which is the most popular English language Bible, which is a Bible translation created by evangelicals for evangelicals. It was really created explicitly as a kind of as a way of selling more Bibles, right? Make a Bible for a specific niche, tailored to their particular kind of interests. And so that was a kind of foray. But then after Zondervan became part of News Corporation in 1988, there was an increasing amount of pressure to maximize the revenue from niches. And so that went a few different directions. On the one hand, they started creating, addressing niches that they hadn't really cared about before or tried to address, including Black evangelicals and Latino evangelicals, who they hadn't really published for before. And then they also created a sort of conservative Republican niche. And that really became the most successful niche. So if you think about all of this happening really in the early 90s and then Fox News Channel launching in 1996, you can see how this sort of segmentation thinking, this way of kind of cordoning off particular niches and feeding them was something that was happening kind of company-wide. And so, just to head toward a conclusion here, we can ask, why was the conservative niche most successful? One reason is that niches are more powerful. People within them, their sort of demand is stronger, I guess. When niches are sort of articulated in contrast with other groups, right? When sort of oppositional, sort of an us versus them sort of posture. And I put it that way partly because, this takes us to Donald Trump, right? When we think about Donald Trump's politics, we think very much about a sort of us versus them rhetoric, that the notion of sort of maximizing a kind of us versus them sort of oppositional stance, and focusing, media attention on the us part, right? On his own niche. And so, the large market segment of evangelicals in the Fox News niche hear him, and they've already been trained to see the world in an us versus them sort of way. So just to wrap up, I just want to say, what I don't say really in the book is that all evangelicals are gullible or duped by commercial media. I spent a lot of time trying to explain how evangelical executives and salespeople. I talk about bookstore managers and ordinary salespeople and all sorts of people in the industry, really try to kind of make sort of religious meaning out of commercial priorities, right? So I don't want to just kind of say everybody's duped or lying to themselves or something like that, or that News Corporation is sort of pulling all the strings in this sort of conspiratorial way. But I do think that the business of religion has absolutely shaped how evangelical culture has been organized, how evangelicals have organized as a political constituency, and come to make their way through our world. And my book explains that over how that came to be over the course of about 100 years. So I'll stop talking now, and I'm happy to talk to you all about any aspect of any of this.
Thank you.
Thanks.
That's so interesting. I have so many questions for you. As you mentioned, I have some familiarity with the evangelical world. My first book was about a semester that I spent at Liberty University as a transfer student from Brown, as sort of my study abroad. And I spent a lot of time in Christian bookstores in the process of writing that book and being at Liberty. And I was always amazed at how big the Christian bookstore world was and how many Bibles there were specifically. Like, I remember just like rows and rows and rows of Bibles targeted at like what seemed to me like very micro niches. Like there would be, the home cook's Bible, or like the military man's Bible, and it'd have like camo on the cover, or there were even Bibles that they like made up to look like a 17 magazine or something like that, so that you could like carry it around if you're a teenage girl and it just looks like you're carrying a Cosmo or something.
Right.
So is that new, that sort of, I know you said that the New International Version was specifically a niche Bible, but is that kind of like micro segmentation of the Bible market specifically new?
Absolutely, yeah. So I point to this last chapter of the book because it's most about the president. It's where I mentioned Donald Trump, and it's where I mentioned Fox News and all of this. So if you only read a chapter, that's the chapter that I think is most sort of. I actually enjoyed writing it the most, and there's all kinds of other stuff in there that I didn't even kind of address. But that's where I also talk about exactly what you're talking about, the kind of micro niching of Bibles. I think, so I present the creation of the NIV as a sort of, again, as a sort of something that kind of demonstrated the profitability of this kind of tactic for companies. And it's something that News Corporation found appealing about Zondervan when they were moving to acquire it. But you know, that's the creation of a translation by evangelicals for evangelicals. But yeah, there are all kinds of other things too. And a lot of this started emerging. So, you know, at the heart of market segmentation, what you need for market segmentation is data, right? So about your consumers. And so around the 80s and 90s, there was a lot more polling about people's religious preferences. And so a great example is I mentioned in the book this moment where there were these new surveys about angels. Like, do you believe in angels? And there was a surprising number of people who said yes. So what do you know? There was an angel Bible that was published, like, you know, a year later or something like that, which was just a King James version with, you know, images of angels and other kinds of like, I don't know, stories about angels and stuff like that. But yeah, so then there were all kinds of other study Bibles and Bibles for graduates and Bibles for, you know, moms and dads and kids and you can go on. And, you know, all you have to do is ask why that is, right? Like once you have, in some way you want to say, once you have a Bible, especially a particular translation of a Bible, you don't need another one, right? If you have a King James version of the Bible, you don't necessarily need another one. So, and evangelical companies have known that. And so then they ask themselves, okay, well, how do we get people to buy more Bibles? And the answer is by having new features or having it tailored to a niche that we didn't even think about before, or we didn't try to kind of produce before. And, you know, that makes up a large part of the evangelical book business. And again, not to kind of give too much airtime to News Corporation, but evangelical executives have told me, firm data is kind of hard to find, but I've heard from several sources, several executives who've estimated that, you know, News Corp owns like 75% of the Bible market, including many kind of niched Bibles. Yeah. So.
And I know I write books, you write books. We're aware that like books are not necessarily the kind of business that they were in the 90s.
Mm-hmm.
So much conversation and organizing energy and even religious practice is moving online.
Mm-hmm.
So how do you think evangelicals as a sort of business are adapting to the internet era? Are they doing it successfully? Do you think they sort of were fast or slow to sort of adapt their marketing and their commercialization to the internet?
Yeah, I've been thinking about doing another project that kind of looks at the sort of now, because 10 years ago when I was asking, when I started asking editors and executives this question, they always sort of played it off. They were like, well, you know, we were really early in kind of going digital and we're not worried about that. We have our steady consumers. And actually still today, like I talked to the CEO of one company a couple years ago and of a publishing company. And he said, actually, you know, in terms of revenue, they're not worried because, you know, Amazon ultimately just helps them. It helps them reach their consumers.
How so?
Well, it helps them reach their consumers with less loss. So the example he gave me is, you know, so someone hears one of our authors on the radio and they can go buy the book and get it immediately, right? So it cuts down on you know, remainder copies that bookstores couldn't sell or something like that. So it's been kind of really great, well, sort of great for publishers, devastating for bookstores, right, and retailers. But in terms of like more broadly how this, I mean, one of the reasons why I think it's been okay for publishers, and one of the ways that I think it's it could be changing evangelicalism, is I think I think what, you know, online purchasing and you know, algorithms have done and are doing is creates kind of more micro niches, right? So it creates more sort of consumer constituencies based around the preferences that are discovered through your browsing history and stuff like that. And right. So it creates more opportunities for companies to find authors who can kind of reach particular kinds of like I don't know, segments of evangelical culture, and also creates more opportunities for authors to go straight to address, audiences, their kind of reading publics through things like Twitter and stuff like that. So it does a big end run around bookstores, and the jury's still out, I think, on whether it how much it undermines the power of publishers. I think for companies like Zondervan and Thomas Nelson through HarperCollins, it's only been good for them because they have both the kind of direct reach on their audience through Twitter and stuff like that, and then they also have Fox News and the kind of that sort of larger kind of media platform. So I don't know. It's, the sort of media economy is changing all the time, and you report on this stuff, right? So,
well, yeah, I was going to say, I mean, I report a lot on social media, and the biggest personality on Facebook by far in the US is Franklin Graham, is Reverend Billy Graham's son,
right.
who is just enormously popular on social media. Everything he posts gets millions of, it's just, he has the kind of market power on that platform that maybe his dad had in Christian bookstores. So, but I wonder too, like, if you think that the sort of secularization of America, the fact that the fastest growing, religious cohort in America is unaffiliated or unreligious, like, do you think that is a challenge for the evangelical book industry?
Yes and no. I mean, I think if you look through the list of bestsellers on Christian on evangelical industry websites, they're not necessarily like explicitly like theological. A lot of them are sort of especially in what's called the Christian living category, they're sort of self-helpy books with kind of Christian language. And you know what, I don't think that. So you say, the largest religious group, the religious group growing the fastest in the US is the kind of nuns or something like that, unaffiliated. But nuns, surveys have shown that people who are unaffiliated are not necessarily like atheists, right? A lot of them are just kind of seekers, or just sort of like interest, spiritual but not religious, right? I teach a course on spirituality, spiritual but not religious. And if you kind of listen to the way that people who identify that way talk about their religious life, they use a lot of evangelical language. Like, I don't know, the way they talk about their spiritual journeys and stuff like that. And why are evangelical kind of phrases and kind of frameworks the things that people reach for when they want to talk about the sort of inner life, their lives as religious seekers? Partly because the books that are out there to kind of go through your journey with are made by evangelical companies, even if they're not, by like Jerry Falwell's descendants, right? They're just kind of more they're more just sort of Christian inspiration kind of stuff. So I think, the rise of the nuns is just like a new sort of evangelical niche, really. So it's
That's
not
interesting. Should we take some questions from people? Yeah, anyone who has a question, feel free to chime in or type it in the box, whatever you want to do. Ted, you're on mute, Ted.
Ted, you're on mute. There you go.
I don't know about the rest of the audience here, but I actually have no idea what differentiates an evangelical from a fundamentalist, from a Southern Baptist, from people who are serious Christians but not affiliated with a denomination. So what makes someone evangelical?
Yeah.
Besides the self-definition.
Yeah. So I mean, for demographic purposes, that's like the main thing. In terms of identifying an evangelical, for scholars, this is like there's scholarly debates are sometimes like navel-gazingly, but for the purposes of giving you kind of good answer, that scholars for a long time have defined evangelicals by way of sort of doctrine-y kind of categories, like a preoccupation with the authority of the Bible, a preoccupation with a personal conversion, the atoning death of Jesus on the cross, things like that. I and kind of a lot of a sort of newer generation of scholars of American religion, I'm kind of away from that, partly because if you look at the list of evangelical doctrines that the scholars have used for a long time, it virtually any Christian can count as an evangelical. So I think what's most important when thinking about evangelicals is an intense emphasis on the kind of authority of the individual. That sounds a little bit vague, but there's this great book by this scholar, Timothy Glegg. It's called Guaranteed Pure. It's about Moody Bible Institute and their kind of their history. But he presents this kind of contrast between what he calls churchly Protestants and evangelical Protestants, right? So churchly Protestants are Protestants who try to follow the kind of teachings of their denomination, of their kind of church-focused identity. And evangelicals are people who find kind of the kind of authority for determining their own Christian lives in like themselves, right? So this kind of impulse to kind of, I'm figuring it out for myself. I'm going to read the Bible for myself and decide what's really right. I'm not, even my pastor is not going to kind of determine what I think about, what religion is. And so this emphasis on the individual, or the ideal of individual authority, I think is important to kind of recognize when we're thinking about evangelicals broadly, because it helps explain why evangelicalism is so compatible with consumerism, which is kind of an individual kind of practice. It explains why evangelicals are so preoccupied with like reading the Bible for yourself, right? Why evangelicals are so preoccupied with individual morality, and also with things like valorizing, seemingly strong businessmen, seemingly strong decision makers, and they talk quite a lot about an emphasis on individual responsibility, so push back on social welfare initiatives, things like this. Why is this intense preoccupation with individual, the sort of priority of the individual? Beyond that, I think another kind of set of defining characteristics are end up being especially around ideas about sex and gender. It's most evangelicals still are sort of anti-gay, and also a lot of, I would say, sort of a large majority of evangelicals have ideas about kind of separate gender roles for men and women, right? What's often called complementarianism, the idea that men and women are different, right, fundamentally, and complement each other in their roles. And so these are ideas which I think about really as kind of cultural ideas that they can often kind of find a biblical kind of rationale for. But if someone else from a different tradition were to read the same passages, they might come to a very different conclusion. So those are the main things I would think about to kind of find who evangelicals are. There are other things we can point to. One thing real quick. There's traditions of kind of theological thinking in evangelicalism. One that's called Dispensationalism, which sort of finds in the Bible this like chronologies that have to do with kind of, God's time, the kind of grand divine plan, sort of finding kind of these sort of mysterious kind of hidden meanings in the Bible. And a lot of scholars would say that this has kind of created the sort of evangelical characteristic that's focused on sort of conspiratorial thinking, or this kind of search for something beyond what's kind of, plainly in view. And I raise this only because, partly with Kevin in mind, I was looking at his Twitter feed earlier, and he seems to be obsessed with the QAnon people. And this sort of conspiratorial thinking, I think, helps explain why so many evangelicals are actually also QAnon types.
Totally. I want to get to Julia's question in the chat. She asks what you meant by rise of the nuns, and how do mainline Protestants fit into the picture you're describing?
Yeah, the rise of the nuns. Sorry, that's like a in-group sort of. It's a scholarly phrase that comes from some reporting the past 10 years or so. It just means the growth of the demographic group that is that claims that they are have no religious affiliation. So
and
when
to be
they
clear, it's NONES,
yes,
not
right.
NUNS.
So when they respond to the question, do you have a religious affiliation? Is it this, or none? They say none. So that's what, so the growth of the people who say none to that question. In mainline Protestants, so, back to Timothy Glegg's churchly Protestant versus evangelical Protestants, he would say mainline Protestants are churchly Protestants, right? So have a denominational affiliation or loyalty that has some sort of meaning for them, right? So it matters for them somehow if they go to a Methodist church or Presbyterian church or something like that. I would say though that even among mainline Protestants, a lot of mainline Protestants read evangelical books, right? So there's, and again, that's partly because something I actually haven't said. That's partly because evangelicals are really the main people who publish sort of Protestant religious literature, right? There aren't really powerful mainline publishing companies, or even really big Catholic publishing companies. If you look at kind of any giant media conglomerate or any big publishing company, and you look for their like religion division, it's an evangelical division almost always. And I think that's partly because it's such a kind of capacious category. It's such a big kind of cultural group. There's a center, and the center is what I showed you in those original slides with Joel Osteen and Jerry Falwell Jr. and people like that. But the sort of periphery of evangelical culture is really broad, and includes a lot of people who might not even necessarily think about themselves as evangelicals. One way I explain this is just to again make the point that the evangelical market has really been generative of evangelical culture, and these companies are always invested in growing their markets, right? Expanding their markets and getting more people to kind of pay attention and be part of a market, right? Almost every evangelical company is a for-profit company. There are very few that are nonprofit firms.
Last question, and then I think we're out of time. Does anyone have anything else? Otherwise, we'll go with Mason's question in the chat here. Professor Vaca, are evangelicals more susceptible to conspiracy theory, e.g. QAnon, and is that a possible threat to control of doctrine or belief structures?
Yes, there's been some reporting on this recently. Caitlin Beatty wrote, if you just Google Caitlin, Beaty, there's an article she wrote, published a couple weeks ago, about how prevalent QAnon thinking has been in evangelical churches. And, in even the tone of her article and the people she interviews, ministers, I think, evangelical ministers are worried that, some evangelical ministers are worried that these sorts of beliefs are sucking the oxygen, I think, out of the the proverbial room. So some are worried about it. I think for others, the QAnon is fundamentally part of support for Donald Trump, right? So for other ministers, it's plausible and worth thinking about, right? Because there's things out there which might seem kooky, but are actually, meaningful and true, and or they might be true if you look into it further, right? So, yeah, I think it's a kind of threat.
I have,
Sure.
so I think that QAnon is really kind of a prank gone wild.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it.
In which case, I mean, it can go anywhere and then people will just follow it.
Yeah.
I have a business idea, Professor Vaca. I think you and I should write the QAnon Bible and sell it in Christian bookstores, and we will make a freaking killing.
That's yeah.
So you do the Old Testament, I'll do the New Testament, and
all right.
we'll meet back in a couple weeks.
All right. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, one thing about the sort of popularity of QAnon, the thing to note is that it's, again, through media consumption, right? So part of the way why I structured the presentation the way I did is just to emphasize that evangelical culture is very much defined by media consumption. And yeah, if QAnon is a prank, it's a prank that's been circulated through media, right? Through social media largely, but definitely through media. And so I'm totally on board, Kevin. We should do that. I'll start working on it tonight.
Great. We're gonna buy a big vacation house with the proceeds.
Okay.
Well, thank you so much to the Brown Club for having us, and thank you, Professor Vaca. That was really, really interesting, and I would encourage people to get and read your book if they haven't. Anything else we should say?
Thank you so much. That's all I'll say. Thank you for coming. You all could be enjoying the better air quality out there, but you're here talking with me, so I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you both for
having me.
Donating your time to us, and it's been really entertaining and enlightening, and in lieu of the upcoming election, a lot to think about. And thanks for bringing some of your Providence precipitation virtually here to the Bay Area. I think that's why the air is cleaner.
I don't want to take credit, but
here.
You never know.
So thanks again, and I just welcome all the alums to frequent our webpage at Brown Club of Greater San Francisco for all of our upcoming events. Stay posted, stay connected. We love seeing you. If you have an idea for an event or a book, an author, a Brown author, faculty, or alum that you would like to hear on this platform, please let us know. And so thanks again, Professor Vaca and Kevin.
Thank you
for your time.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, everyone.